often seems the business world is a great machine, productive and highly efficient, constantly turning out the goods and services our society wants and needs. Everything seems in balance. It's the parts working in harmony. Production, finance, marketing, engineering, all well-oiled, effectively managed, hitting on all cylinders. Yet beneath it all, there is a shadow, an unseen presence. Harmony. For if a machine runs at all, it also runs at risk. And it is likely that every business will fall one day victim to the odds, and the machine will be damaged or destroyed. Each year, businesses are devastated by fire or flood. Losses to facilities, equipment, personnel, even a computer database make it difficult or impossible for the companies to survive. Often employees are injured in work-related accidents, or a company's people or products may cause costly accidents to others, accidents which might result in devastating lawsuits. Thieves may break into a building and steal expensive equipment or product or industrial secrets. Key managers may die suddenly, leaving the business without leadership. In our turbulent, shrinking new world, businesses are tormented by terrorists and saboteurs. Executives are sometimes kidnapped and held for ransom. Our businesses are extremely vulnerable to risk. Risk masquerading in 1,000 forms, from tornado to terrorist. And the consequence of that risk, in both human terms and in economic terms, is enormous. It is a direct frontal attack on the bottom line, profit. Unlike other areas of business, risk cannot be absolutely controlled. It can't be reduced to a black and white formula, will not respond to threats or reward. Therefore, of all the elements one must manage in business, risk is the most difficult. Also, among the most important. It doesn't matter how expertly a person markets a product or service, or how well the person manages people or finance or production. If that person doesn't identify risks within the organization and develop a strategy for dealing with them, one might do everything right and still go wrong. For sooner or later, every business must do business with the odds. Hello, I'm Alex Burton, and this is the Business File. When we planned that piece on risk, I didn't mean it to turn out so grim. In fact, it seemed not at all unlike the evening news. And yet I suppose that really is the heart of our point. We live in a world that abounds with risk. In our personal lives, we take steps to manage that risk. It's as natural as wearing a coat against the cold. And in our business lives, we must also take steps to protect our companies, our products, our people, and our profits from loss. And that, as you may have supposed, is the topic of today's program, managing risk. Although risk has always been with us, the management of risk using rather sophisticated techniques is relatively new. Now, we are going to meet a new breed of executive called the risk manager, and we'll explore their world and their methods. And we will visit a company in Texas that utilizes a very highly regarded risk management program, and we'll see just what makes it tick. Today, we'll begin a series of visits with a stop at the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia, to talk with Professor Dawn Hardigree of the Department of Insurance, Real Estate, and Legal Studies. How are you today, Dawn? We're glad to be here.
Well, I'm pleased that you're glad to be here, and I'm doing fine, thank you.
Professor Hardigree, some of the terms we deal with here on the Business File are surprisingly elusive. Now, risk, I think, is one of those terms. How do you define risk?
When you say the word risk, you're generally talking about uncertainty as to future outcomes. There are a lot of different types of risk, but the two that we generally talk about are pure risk and speculative risk. Pure risk are those situations that have two possible outcomes, a loss or no loss, a fire or no fire. A speculative risk, we have a third outcome, a gain. Engaging in a stock market transaction may be a speculative risk. But in the field of risk management, we focus almost all of our energies and attentions on the area of pure risk.
But isn't risk simply a part of the game? Business is a gamble. The entrepreneur is, by definition, a risk taker. Why should we be concerned with something that's just a natural part of what we do?
I guess in a nutshell that a pure risk situation could lead to the extinction of the business, bankruptcy. The Johns Manville Corporation, I think they're known differently now. Their very existence is being threatened, and they're operating now under the protection of bankruptcy law because a risk of injury to employees was not handled properly. As a result, their very existence is threatened. One liability loss can result in a total liquidation of the firm.
Then how does a business go about coping with risk so that it has the least amount of impact on the firm?
In order to effectively cope with risk, you have to establish a long-term, ongoing program of risk evaluation. You have to first identify the risks that are faced. That's the most important step. If you fail to identify a risk, you fail to handle it properly. And by properly, I mean with knowledge. In order to give your company the best chance of surviving any one circumstance, any one happenstance, you've got to not only identify the risk, but you have to do some evaluation of what's the likelihood of occurrence, and if it occurs, what will it do to us? What's the severity resulting from this exposure? And then that leads us into an effective decision-making process. How should we handle the risk?
Identify the risk, evaluate the risk, and then take action. What are some of the ways risk managers handle risk?
In general, any risk that we face may be handled by either one or some combination of these following strategies. The most obvious is avoidance. We may avoid certain risks. We may avoid the risk of having American personnel kidnapped or subject to terrorist attack in Latin America, let us say, by means of not engaging in activities there. We may reduce risks. We may engage in activities that have a tendency toward either reducing the likelihood of happenstance. Locking your door probably reduces the likelihood of someone just walking in and taking something. So we reduce frequency there. Reduction also takes the form of reduction of severity. A sprinkler system in a home or in a business, some water sprinkler system or a gas sprinkler system doesn't prevent the fire from occurring, but once the fire does occur, it reduces the severity or the cumulative total of the loss. So we've either avoided a risk, we've reduced a risk. Many risks lend themselves primarily toward retention and transfer, retention or assumption, both words are used. When we assume a risk, we make sure that a part of what we face is dealt with out of our own pocket. You do that now with a deductible on your automobile. A business may do that in a similar manner by self-insuring or by some funding scheme, assuming a part of the risk. Those risks which are catastrophic in nature, those that are life-threatening, must be transferred. And generally the transfer mechanism that we utilize is insurance. But there are others. A lease is a transfer device. Incorporation is a transfer device. We transfer the risk from Don Hardigrees, sole proprietor, to the XYZ Corporation, a separate legal entity.
Don, if I may, I'd like to hold our conversation there for a moment. Now, however, we are going to talk with a risk manager and see some risk situations. Earlier in the program, I mentioned we would be visiting with risk managers. To find out just what the role of the risk manager involves, we're in Angleton, Texas, to speak with Dan McCoy, Vice President of Intermedics and Executive Director of Risk Management, Personnel, Safety, Security, and Office Services. And that covers all the major areas of risk management. Dan, we're looking forward to talking with you, and thanks for letting us come by.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Alex.
This whole area of risk management is rather new to most of us. I wonder if you might outline your role as a professional risk manager.
We try and protect the company against significant financial losses which may occur to it, protect the assets, the earning power that the company has, and we try and, in the aggregate, keep these costs to a minimum.
In developing a risk management program, what are the things you consider?
In developing it, we're looking at the three basic areas that compose a company. That's the people or the personnel of the company, the hard physical assets or the property, and the liability risks that the company would be faced with in manufacturing a product. With identifying these three areas, we try and develop strategies which would avoid the risk, which would reduce the risk, which would allow us to assume certain of the risks, and quite often we will transfer the risk.
But how do you go about identifying these risks so you'll be able to work with them?
It's a process where we try and integrate ourselves throughout the company. We're using all sources of information, from talking with the auditors, to management meetings, to personnel reports, financial information, drawing all these sources together and trying to identify the risks that we're faced with.
Okay, Dan, but what kind of process do you go through? Do you try to quantify information, or is it just a flipped coin?
Obviously, today there are very sophisticated computer models that can be used in predicting frequency, predicting severity of losses for products. In our company, with the type of medical products we have computer programs that have very, very high credibility in telling us what will happen and the frequency that it will happen.
Well, thank you, Dan. I'd like you to rejoin us later, but first, watch with me a brief piece that we made at your plant earlier this week. Here at Freeport, Texas, Intermedics Corporation manufactures a wide range of sophisticated devices used in the healing arts. The company has established an equally sophisticated system of identifying and dealing with risk in the areas of property, personnel, and liability. Among the more obvious risks represented here is the possibility of unauthorized entry, the chance that property or proprietary information might be stolen. To guard against this risk, Intermedics has established man-traps throughout the facility. To gain access, one needs a special coded access card. Throughout the buildings. In the manufacturing process, hazardous materials are used. Chemicals present a continuing risk of fire or explosion. To minimize the risk to personnel and property, a centralized storage facility has been established some distance from the main plant. This isolated facility is essentially an explosion-proof building. The roof is attached with loops of steel cable. If an explosion were to occur within, the roof would lift, diminishing the effect of the blast. Since the company's products are used by doctors and hospitals, there is an ever-present liability risk. Here in the ethylene oxide sterilization room, that risk is reduced by assuring the products are not contaminated when they leave the facility. The chamber is also isolated from employees to reduce the possibility of contact with the dangerous gas. This facility is called the glove box. Its primary function is to assure the product is made in a controlled environment, thus reducing liability risk, yet it also helps assure employee safety. Since employees are working with hazardous gases and chemicals, there is always the risk of injury. This automatic eye wash has been installed to reduce the severity of an accident which might have already occurred. The strategy is an overall reduction of risk in the personnel area. Precision of tolerances and absolute cleanliness are essential in the manufacture of Intermedic products. A reduction in either increases the risk of product liability. This clean room affords an ideal environment for manufacture. Special footwear reduces static electricity, and doormats reduce the possibility of an accumulation of dust which might affect product quality. At Intermedics, because of the need for absolute product integrity, and because of the hazardous nature of the manufacturing process, it would seem that risk in the areas of property, personnel, and product liability would be difficult to control. Yet even here, with care and planning, the management of risk can be planned for and managed. Now that we've actually seen various forms of risk in their environment at Intermedics, let's rejoin Dan McCoy. And also joining us are two additional risk managers. First, Judith Torney is Director of Risk Management for Transamerica Corporation. Now, the importance of her position becomes evident when you realize Transamerica is a multi-billion-dollar corporation. That's a lot of risk. Among the subsidiaries of Transamerica are insurance companies, brokerage firms, manufacturers of precision-engineered machinery, a container and trailer leaser, Transamerica Airlines, and Budget Rent-A-Car. Judith, it's good to see you, and I'm looking forward to our visit.
Well, thank you, Alex.
And with us from La Jolla, California is Dan Hilder, Assistant Treasurer and Corporate Risk Manager of the Signal Companies Incorporated. Signal Companies is a high-technology and engineering company operating worldwide, and this multi-billion-dollar firm employs nearly 60,000 people. Dan, it's a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Alex.
Knowing that all three of you deal with personnel, property, and liability areas of risk, Dan Hilder, let me ask you first about liability. What specific strategies do you use in dealing with risk in the area of liability?
I guess the first strategy you might use would be to avoid the liability entirely. One example of that might be if you're asked to sign a lease for a particular building that you're interested in using in your business. You would want to examine that lease, all the clauses in that lease, to determine what liabilities are in there. And in doing that, you may identify certain liabilities that you may not want to take, or you may identify some liabilities that you evaluate to be too risky for you to take. You could avoid that entirely by finding another building of comparable suitability, which you could then substitute for the first lease. Another item that you might want to do is to reduce your liability in some fashion. A good example of that would be if you were in the contracting business and you were asked to build a building for someone. The owner of that building might want you to assume an unlimited amount of liability for the design and construction of that building. A good risk management technique would be to reduce the amount of liability you're taking by substituting a liquidated damage clause, which would then pin down your damages to a specific amount of money for a specific number of days. And in doing that, you have certainly substantially reduced the amount of liability that you've taken under that contract.
What about assuming the risk, Dan?
Now, the liabilities that you would want to assume are those liabilities which you feel are predictable. I submit that any time you have a frequency of losses, that frequency would then lead you to some predictability of those losses. And you can create a database which throws into that computer database all of your past losses, the amount of those losses, and the products that are associated with those losses. And you can use that to give yourself some idea as to where your losses are occurring and in what dollar amounts. We would only want to insure losses above the predictable level. For example, if 95% of our losses were occurring in amounts of less than $250,000, we would only want to insure losses in excess of $250,000. We would want to assume the losses that were normal ourselves rather than having an insurance company do it. For those losses that we feel are unpredictable, be they substantial losses or unique losses, we would then want to transfer that risk off to a private insurance company and pay them a premium and have them take the risk themselves.
Judy, let's turn for a moment from liability to the area of personnel risk. What strategies do you employ at Transamerica?
We use 4 basic strategies: avoidance, reduction, assumption, and transfer of risk. In the avoidance area, we might recommend to a subsidiary that it not buy property located near a hazardous waste disposal site because of the obvious danger to employees. In the area of reduction, we would recommend to appropriate plants that certain employees wear eye and ear protection. And also, whenever we hire new employees, if they're going to be driving company automobiles, we do check on their MVRs to make sure that they have good driving records. In the area of assumption, we have a large deductible on our workers' compensation program. We have a $500,000 self-insured retention, and above that, we transfer the risk by buying insurance from insurance companies.
Dan McCoy, What specific strategies do you use in dealing with risk in the area of property?
It's very similar to liability as also to personnel. We have to identify what property we need, the machinery, the assets, and then we look at those physical assets and decide, can we avoid the risk of loss, such as contracting with someone else to produce a part rather than produce it ourselves and have the machinery ourselves and have to have the people. We can try and reduce the risk of loss to the property, such as sprinklers. If a loss were to occur, rather than having the whole plant go from a fire, it would retain that loss, reduce it to a specific area. We will assume risks, again in the property area, by saying that, yes, we need that machine, or we need to use these chemicals, and it's highly perhaps flammable or explosive. We'll design, we'll set a separate building aside, and perhaps if we can't contractually transfer it because it's necessary, we'll still retain that risks. And then for those risks, again, that are significantly financially detrimental, we will transfer through the insurance mechanism.
All of you have mentioned transferring risk through the use of insurance. Now, Judy, if I might ask you to be a consultant for a second, if you were giving advice, what basic kinds of insurance coverage should the average business have?
Well, I think there are 4 basic types of coverage. First of all, property coverage, which would protect the corporation from loss to its physical assets. Secondly, liability coverage, and there would be 2 general areas there. General liability, which protects the corporation from third-party public liability, for instance, a slip and fall in the building. And automobile liability coverage, which protects the company from automobile accidents. Then workers' compensation insurance, which protects the company from losses as a result of employees being injured in the scope and course of their employment. And lastly, fidelity or crime coverage, which protects the corporation from losses due to theft or burglary or the employees embezzling money.
Thank you, Judy. Well, I've really enjoyed talking with all of you. Judy, thank you for letting us visit with you.
Well, thank you very much, Alex, for letting me be of service.
Dan Hilder, Dan McCoy, thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Alex.
Thank you.
Risk management, as you can see, is a very broad field, for risk itself is extremely pervasive. It manages to intrude into every aspect of a company's business. Since every company, every business is different, it would seem the nature of the risks would be different. Well, let us revisit Athens, Georgia at Professor Hardigree. Professor Hardigree, you heard with me how companies have their own unique risk environments, and certainly no 2 companies handle their risk management programs exactly alike. But are there any basic guidelines or philosophies or principles that are common to all risk management programs?
Yes. Muir and Hedges, in there, I think, an early 1960s book, the first book that I'm aware of in the field of risk management, set forth the 3 rules of risk management. Don't risk a lot for a little. That's the first. Don't risk a lot for a little. If you have some method of dealing with a risk that is not terribly costly, yet if something were to occur, let us say a liability loss were to occur, it could be catastrophic in nature, don't expose yourself to a lot of loss when you could have done away with that risk by means of a little, spending a small insurance premium, let us say. Don't risk more than you can afford to lose. I've always used that as the poker playing rule. If I go play cards at night, I will take the amount of money I've got to lose. In a business scenario, if you cannot afford to lose the firm in itself, then don't expose it. And the final one is consider the odds. You must consider the likelihood of occurrence. Are we facing a loss that could result in $1 million loss per occurrence? How likely is it? Will it occur once this year, twice this year, 10 times this year? So one must consider the odds, look at the likelihood of happenstance, because just the total amount of loss in itself is not enough. And those are the 3 rules. Don't risk more than you can afford to lose. Don't risk a lot for a little. Consider the odds, the poker playing rules or the risk management rules.
Well, thank you, Professor Hardegree. I love that poker analogy, and I only hope I can remember those 3 rules the next time I'm at the table. Don't risk more than you can afford to lose. Don't risk a lot for a little, and consider the odds. Well, it seems to me there's an important choice that every business must make in regard to risk. A company can be a passive victim of chance, or it can aggressively choose to make its own luck. Now, you take Intermedics, for instance. They're making their own luck. There was a chance of a chemical explosion. So they chose to build an isolated, explosion-proof building in which to house the chemicals. There was a chance of theft. So they chose to create man-traps. There was a chance of product contamination. So they chose to create sterile production areas. This, I believe, is the heart of risk management. Choice over chance. Until the next time, I'm Alex Burton, and this has been The Business File.
The preceding program is part of a college credit course.